Hi, this is TapCat, and welcome to part 1 of my combat guide for XCOM Chimera Squad. Today we'll cover breach mode in depth, and in part 2 we'll cover battlefield tactics on the main combat map. If you'll give me the next 10 minutes or so, I'll do my best to help you keep your agents alive and fighting. Breach mode is part of a significant change to combat encounters in XCOM. Rather than exploring a map until you cross paths with one or more groups of enemies, each mission in Chimera Squad begins with a breach, followed by more familiar turn-based tactical combat. Now, missions can have anywhere from 1 to 3 encounters, and each one starts with its own breach. While there's a lot of variation in how breaches work, we'll start by showing a simple example from start to finish so you'll have a baseline understanding, and then dig a little deeper into the tricky stuff. In this example, there's just one possible entry point, and because it's closely watched by the enemy, we're going to take +1 damage from any enemy shots that hit us during the breach. Now that's something I'd avoid if I had the choice, but since that's not an option, we'll try to mitigate the damage in another way, as I'll show you in just a moment. Now first, we need to assign our agents, and it's important to remember that the order you assign them here is the order that they'll take their turns for the rest of not just the breach, but the whole encounter. Our sectoid Verge is one of my favorite agents, and I often put him up front. Next, I went with Cherub because getting his shield up early in combat can be very useful. But for the breach itself, I've actually come to prefer Godmother going second because her shotgun hits the hardest of all the weapons, but it has some of the worst accuracy, and it really helps to know early on what you're going to get from her, if anything. With the order selected, we'll enter the combat area, and right away, we're thrown into the deep end of the pool. Now, there are usually more enemies than you'll want to see, but the one thing we need to know right now is that each of our agents gets exactly 1 shot before any of them get a chance to move. After that, only the enemies labeled as aggressive will get to return fire before we all scramble for cover and start the main phase of combat. Given that we usually only have enough firepower to kill 1 or 2 aliens depending on the target, you have to decide whether it's more important to you to take out a particularly dangerous bad guy who may be surprised, or focus on the aggressive enemies to prevent soaking up too much damage when they return fire. In this instance, I decided to take out the lone aggressive enemy who was also starting behind cover, something that's not unusual. And this is where Verge shines at the start of the order in Breach. His levitation ability lifts the paladin up so that it no longer has cover, and the rest of the squad can tear him to pieces. With the paladin down, there are no enemies left who can return fire during the breach, so we go right into the main combat phase. There are certainly other ways we could have approached this, but we were successful at cutting off the enemy from taking a shot that would have done extra damage if it had hit. So now that we've gone through the basic sequence, let's dig into some of the deeper decision making that you can do. Before we're done, we'll talk about what to consider when it comes to choosing among the entry point options, how turn order doesn't always turn out like you expect it to, and finally, some of the abilities and items that are available specifically for breaches and how to use them. First, let's discuss the entry points, and the planning for them can start back at the base. When you select the mission and go to the loadout screen, it shows the projected breach options. Doors sometimes require someone with a gremlin to hack. Walls can typically only be entered with a breach charge, and vents can be used by your Viper. There's also equipment you can buy that will replicate the effect of having a particular agent along. You don't have to bring any of these things, of course. There's always going to be at least one way for the squad to go in, even if they don't have any special gear or abilities. But it's usually to your advantage to prepare for at least some of the possibilities, because you'll have more options and they almost always offer advantages that the main entrance won't. But this is XCOM, so you'll find some entrances where your only choice is how to manage whatever negative effect the game hands you. For example, sometimes the last soldier through the door can be routed to wherever they end up at the start of combat for 1 turn. I'll typically use a support role for that and then just try to protect them as best I can. It's not great to have someone stuck in one place no matter who they are, but we definitely want to use someone who doesn't need to move as much in order to be effective. Try doing that with someone carrying a shotgun and you'll quickly realize there's a good chance they'll be dead weight at a time when you desperately want to start thinning the enemy's numbers. While we can't go through all of the different perks and penalties that entry points offer, let me just say that it's well worth it to invest a minute or two in thinking about which agent would be best suited for whichever situation you're out to put them in. For example, if one spot starts an agent with no ammo, someone like Patchwork makes sense because she can still deal damage with her gremlin. Just try to consider how to get the most out of a bonus or minimize the effect of a penalty. Other choices are more subtle and should reflect your approach to the game. If Godmother or Axiom, both of whom use shotguns, are in your group, would you prefer to mitigate their biggest weakness with an aim bonus, or double down on their damage output with an increase to their critical hit chance? Now, I don't believe there's one right answer, but after choosing the crit and missing, I realized that my personal preference is to go for consistency and let someone with a higher aim do a little more damage with the crit bonus. Whichever way you go, I think that you'll be a lot happier if you consciously weigh the choice than you would be with a more haphazard approach. I mentioned earlier that as you add agents to the entry point, that will determine the turn order. And while that's true as far as it goes, you should be aware that when you use multiple entrances, that choice alone can change the order significantly. In this clip, you can see that as I added the first 3 agents, they fell right in line. But once we added that last agent into the door on the left, she jumped in front of all the others. Unfortunately, that does mean you'll need to balance your preferred turn order against the entry bonuses before you can assign agents. I believe it should typically flow from left to right, but just to be safe, always keep one eye on that right-hand part of the screen where their order is, and make sure that it's coming out the way you expect. Breach abilities are fairly easy to manage, partly because no one agent will typically have more than one. One example is Patchwork, who can apply hollow targeting to every enemy in the room, not just for the breach phase, but the whole encounter. It's important to point out though, you can only select this at the time she's added to an entry point. If you add the next agent after her, then the option disappears, and the only way to get it back is remove both of them from the entry point and start over. By the way, the screen makes it look as though we're choosing between breaching fire or the special ability, and that is not the case. She'll get to fire no matter what. It just comes down to whether or not you want to use that ability as well. And you might ask, well, why wouldn't you always use it? But that's because it only covers this encounter, and you can only use it once per mission. So if there's only one encounter for the mission, then that's great. You should just go for it every time. But it's not uncommon for there to be 2 or even 3 encounters all bundled into one mission, and they frequently ramp up in difficulty as you go along. So my advice is use them carefully. I typically avoid using them the first encounter and will only use it on the second if I'm feeling like we were significantly weakened in some way or we need a boost. You'll usually have multiple agents with abilities like this, so you can always use one that you feel like you really need now and save the rest for the third encounter. And of course, whatever's left in the tank can all be used in that last encounter. Just go all out, because it's not like you can bank any unused ones for the next mission. Finally, I do just want to point out that Verge's Levitate can be used for each encounter, so it doesn't have to be rationed. And I believe the Gunslinger has an attack that works the same way. And remember, it always pays to read these ability descriptions carefully so you know exactly what your options are. As you can see in this video clip, there are also a number of items that can be bought in the supply store and brought along on missions. Some of them mimic abilities that are already possessed by one of our agents, and some are completely unique. I certainly don't advocate trying to bring all of them along, but experimenting with a few is a good idea. I consider breaching charges a must for any mission that includes a wall, and I can say that hollow targeting everyone in the room definitely comes in handy. And the meta patch can be a nice boost on missions with multiple encounters, but will otherwise just take up space. Beyond that, your personal playstyle and priorities are going to weigh heavily in choosing which of these you care to invest in. Alright, I think we've just about covered the basics of breach mode. There's a surprising amount to consider given how little time the process takes, and those choices can have a real impact on the rest of the battle. The one area we haven't spent much time on is enemy selection once you enter the combat area. The problem is that it's simply too situational to give a detailed recommendation. There are a lot of different enemy types in this game, and after the early missions, you'll routinely fight different mixes of 9 or more aliens on one map, and a lot of them you'll wish you could kill right out of the gate, and it won't even be remotely possible in that one turn. It's also dependent on the squad you brought and their mix of abilities, because some enemies are much less effective against certain agents and more so against others, so their priority can rise or fall just depending on who you've brought to the party. That said, here are some ideas to get you started. The more I've played, the less I've been scared of enemies who simply deal damage. An enemy who sets half your squad on fire so they can't use any of their abilities is much more dangerous. Likewise, enemies who root an agent in place, stun them, or worst of all, mind control them, are all high priority targets. You can heal damage, and you can kill enemies quickly, but only with your special skills and ability to move around intact. On the relatively rare occasions when the special powers of the enemies aren't too crazy, but their numbers are even greater than usual, I would suggest whittling their numbers as fast as you can to avoid the incoming damage from overwhelming your ability to heal through it. In that situation, taking out 4 relatively weak enemies with low health is usually better than using the entire squad against one guy who does more than any one of them, but nowhere near as much as all combined. Basically, consider your enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and how those stack up against the squad you've brought along. Since you can't get rid of all of them, it really is a moment where you pick your poison, and then do your best to move forward from there. Of course, if you have a useful tip of your own, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And one last point on breaches. When your squad runs for cover at the end of breach mode, they don't always find good cover, and they can take damage as a result. If you find that a particular agent just doesn't have a quality shot, there's always the option of having them use the cover rush ability instead of firing. Now, I didn't use it extensively, but it does add 75 to both their defense and dodge until they take their first turn. So that kind of protection could certainly be more useful than taking a low percentage shot. Alright, if you've stayed with me this long and found the video helpful, then please give it a like to help other people find it as well. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, you might want to do that, as I will publish part 2 of this combat guide soon, and we'll cover the battlefield decisions right from the point where breach mode ends. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. I hope we see you next time.